On February 27, 2026, a senior Omani diplomat announced that peace talks between Iran and the United States had reached a breakthrough. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium. Full international verification was on the table. The negotiators called it historic. Talks were scheduled to resume on March 2nd. On February 28th, at 06:35 in the morning, the United States launched airstrikes on Iran. Nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had governed Iran for 37 years, was killed before the day was over. On March 2nd, the day talks were supposed to resume, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. The world had been here before. For 2,500 years, every civilization, every empire, every great power that ever wanted to control the flow of trade and energy between East and West has understood the same brutal fact. Whoever controls this 33-kilometer passage of water controls the throat of the world. And right now, in March 2026, that throat is being squeezed shut. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz, from the Persian Empire to the 2026 crisis, and why what is happening there today was, in every meaningful sense, inevitable. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and beyond that to the Arabian Sea and the open ocean. It is flanked on the north by Iran and on the south by Oman and the United Arab Emirates. At its narrowest point, the navigable shipping lanes are just a few kilometers wide, barely enough for 2 lanes of supertanker traffic moving in opposite directions. The Persian Gulf itself is a geological accident of extraordinary strategic consequence. Beneath its shallow waters and the surrounding desert terrain lies the largest concentration of hydrocarbon reserves on Earth. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar, between them, hold the majority of the world's proven oil reserves and a vast proportion of its natural gas. Every barrel of oil that leaves this region by sea must pass through one bottleneck, the Strait of Hormuz. The strait takes its name from the ancient island of Hormuz, once a prosperous trading port that stood at the entrance to the Gulf. But the waterway's strategic importance predates any name. The ancient Persians understood it. Alexander the Great sought to control it. The Arab caliphates depended on it. The Portuguese bled for it. The British built an empire partly through it. And now, in the 21st century, it remains the single most consequential choke point in the global economy. Approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through the strait every single day. That represents roughly 1/5 of all the oil traded globally. Add liquefied natural gas, and the Strait of Hormuz accounts for approximately 1/3 of the world's traded LNG as well. There is no other single point on Earth through which so much of the world's primary energy supply must pass. The first civilization to truly grasp the strategic value of the Persian Gulf and its southern exit was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the first great superpower of the ancient world. Under Cyrus the Great, Darius, and Xerxes, the Persians built an empire stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, and the Persian Gulf served as its maritime spine. Persian naval power projected into the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean, connecting the empire's eastern provinces to its western trade networks. When Alexander the Great destroyed the Achaemenid Empire in 330 BCE, he immediately understood what he had taken. His admiral Nicaros was dispatched to explore the Persian Gulf and map the sea route from India to Mesopotamia. Alexander himself planned to establish a new capital at Babylon and build a navy that would dominate both the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea.
He died in 323 BCE before completing that vision, but the strategic logic he recognized would echo across 2 millennia. The Arab conquests of the 7th century CE brought new masters to the Persian Gulf, and with them came an explosion of maritime trade. Arab navigators and merchants became the great intermediaries of the medieval world's most profitable commerce, the spice and silk trade connecting China, India, and Southeast Asia to the markets of the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The port of Siraf on the Persian coast, and later the island of Hormuz itself, became among the wealthiest entrepôts in the known world. Ibn Battuta, the great Arab traveler of the 14th century, described Hormuz Island as one of the most important commercial cities he had visited anywhere in his extraordinary journeys. The strait was not merely a geographical feature, it was the hinge of the world's most profitable trading system. The arrival of Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama in the Indian Ocean in 1498 changed everything. For the first time, a European power had found a sea route to Asia that bypassed the Arab and Ottoman middlemen who controlled the overland Silk Road and the Red Sea routes. The Portuguese immediately understood that control of the Indian Ocean required control of its choke points, and the Strait of Hormuz was the most critical of all. In 1507, the Portuguese admiral Alfonso de Albuquerque attacked and captured the island of Hormuz. He understood with absolute clarity what he was doing. Whoever is lord of Hormuz has his hand on the throat of all trade, he reportedly said. The Portuguese held Hormuz for more than a century, using it as the anchor of a maritime empire that stretched from Lisbon to Macau. The Portuguese were eventually expelled from Hormuz in 1622, ironically with the help of English forces, but the pattern they established endured. Every subsequent maritime empire that projected power into the Indian Ocean recognized the Persian Gulf and its exit to the sea as a prize of first order. The British East India Company gradually extended its influence into the Persian Gulf in the 18th and 19th centuries, suppressing piracy, signing treaties with the Arab rulers of the Gulf Coast, and establishing the network of relationships that would eventually produce the modern states of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait. When oil was discovered in commercial quantities in Persia in 1908, the first major oil discovery in the Middle East, the strategic significance of the region was transformed beyond anything its previous masters had imagined. The 20th century converted the Persian Gulf from an energy center to the energy center of the entire industrialized world. In 1900, the Gulf produced virtually no oil. By 1970, it was producing a third of the world's total supply. By 1980, the countries bordering the Gulf held more than half of all proven global oil reserves. The United States became increasingly dependent on Gulf imports as domestic production peaked in 1970. Western Europe and Japan had no domestic oil to speak of. They were entirely dependent on Gulf exports for the energy that powered their economies. And Iran, sitting astride the northern shore of the strait, occupied the most commanding geographic position of all. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 shattered the strategic architecture the United States had built around the Gulf. The Shah of Iran, the most important regional ally, was swept from power by Ayatollah Khamenei's Islamic Revolution. And almost immediately, the new Iranian government established the ideological framework that has defined its relationship with the Strait of Hormuz since. The strait was an instrument of leverage, a weapon, a card to be played when Iran felt threatened. The Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988 produced the first modern Hormuz crisis. Both sides attacked oil tankers in what became known as the Tanker War. By 1987, the situation had become so dangerous that Kuwait requested that its tankers be reflagged under the American flag and escorted by the U.S. Navy. Earnest Will became the largest American naval convoy operation since the Second World War. The lesson was clear and never forgotten. The Strait of Hormuz is simultaneously the world's most vital maritime artery and its most manipulable pressure point.
Iran's relationship with the Strait of Hormuz is not merely strategic, it is existential. The strait is the one instrument of leverage that Iran possesses that no amount of sanctions, military superiority, or diplomatic pressure can easily neutralize. Iran does not need to close the strait permanently to inflict catastrophic damage on the global economy. It needs only to make passage sufficiently dangerous, expensive, and uncertain that the normal functioning of oil markets breaks down. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, spent decades developing the military capabilities specifically designed to hold the strait at risk. Fast attack boats that can swarm larger warships, mines seeded across the shipping lanes at night, anti-ship missiles positioned along the Iranian coastline, submarines capable of operating in the Gulf's shallow waters. The IRGC's doctrine for the strait is not conventional naval warfare. It is asymmetric pressure, just enough threat to make insurance premiums unmanageable, tanker operators unwilling, and the economic cost of transit prohibitive. Iran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz on multiple occasions, during the Iran-Iraq War, during the nuclear negotiations of the 2000s and 2010s, and most explicitly following the assassination of IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani by a U.S. drone strike in January 2020. Each time, the United States responded with naval deployments, and each time the crisis de-escalated. The nuclear negotiations of the 2010s produced the JCPOA agreement in 2015, which briefly offered the prospect of a stable relationship between Iran and the West. The United States' withdrawal from that agreement in 2018, the reimposition of sweeping sanctions, and the subsequent collapse of diplomatic channels left Iran and the United States in a state of sustained maximum pressure with no functional off-ramp. The conditions for what is now happening were not created in 2026. They were created over a decade of failed diplomacy and escalating miscalculation. On February 25, 2026, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that a historic agreement to avert military conflict was within reach. 2 days later, on February 27th, Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Busaidi, announced a genuine breakthrough had been reached. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium, to accept full IAEA verification, and to irreversibly downgrade its enriched uranium stockpile. Talks were scheduled to resume on March 2nd. The world believed, for perhaps 48 hours, that war had been avoided. At 20:38 UTC on February 27th, President Trump gave the order to proceed. At 06:35 UTC on February 28th, CENTPOM announced that partner forces had begun airstrikes on Iran. B-2 stealth bombers, B-1 Lancers, and B-52 Stratofortresses struck from the air. U.S. warships launched Tomahawk cruise missiles. The U.S. Army deployed HIMARS rocket systems. Nearly 800 strikes were conducted in the first 12 hours alone. At approximately 06:45 UTC, the Israeli Air Force began a simultaneous and unprecedented wave of decapitation strikes.
Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had governed the Islamic Republic since 1989, was killed alongside several senior officials and members of his family at his residential compound. Trump announced the strikes via an 8-minute video on Truth Social at 2 a.m. Eastern Time. There was no public address, there was no congressional briefing beyond the legally required War Powers notification and a closed Gang of 8 session. The stated objectives were 4: prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, destroy its missile arsenal and production facilities, degrade its proxy networks, and annihilate its navy, alongside an unstated but desired political outcome of regime change from within. Among the first casualties was a girls' school adjacent to a naval base in Minab near Bandar Abbas, struck by a missile that killed approximately 170 people. In the opening days, the UAE claimed to have downed 148 Iranian drones, 9 ballistic missiles, and 6 cruise missiles. Iran launched large-scale retaliatory strikes on U.S. military bases, Israeli territory, and Gulf states. 7 U.S. service members were killed by March 10th. The IRGC drone and helicopter carrier, Iris Shahid Bagheri, converted from a container ship, was struck within hours of the opening operations. The Iranian frigate, Iris Dena, was sunk by a U.S. submarine off the coast of Galle, Sri Lanka, killing 87 of its crew. The first ship sunk by a submarine in active combat since the Falklands War of 1982. March 2nd, the day peace talks had been scheduled to resume, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. An IRGC commander stated the strait was closed and any vessel attempting to transit would be set ablaze. The IRGC's Khatam al-Anbiya headquarters announced that any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be considered a legitimate target. Within 48 hours, over 150 ships had anchored outside the strait to avoid the risk. Tanker traffic dropped first by approximately 70%, then to effectively zero. On March 5th, Iran clarified that the closure was selective rather than total. The strait would remain closed only to ships from the U.S., Israel, and their Western allies. Turkey negotiated separately. By March 13th, Iran approved the passage of a Turkish vessel. 2 Indian-flagged gas carriers and a Saudi oil tanker carrying 1 million barrels of oil bound for India were also permitted to pass. The closure was a weapon aimed with surgical precision, not at all commerce, but at Western commerce specifically. The economic consequences were immediate and staggering. On March 8th, Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years, rising to a peak of $126 per barrel. The IEA described the closure as the largest disruption to the energy supply since the 1970s oil crisis. The IEA took the unprecedented step of releasing 400 million barrels from global strategic reserves. But with 20 million barrels normally flowing through the strait each day, that release covers only 20 days of typical flows. Daily oil exports from the Gulf fell by at least 60%. The IRGC threatened oil could reach $200 per barrel. An IRGC statement read, "You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil." Goldman Sachs raised its U.S. recession probability by 5 percentage points to 25%. Oxford Economics modeled that oil averaging $140 per barrel for 2 months would push the Eurozone, the UK, and Japan into economic contraction. The economic damage extended beyond oil. Fertilizer prices spiked immediately. New Orleans urea prices rose from $475 to $680 per metric ton in days, with roughly one-third of global fertilizer trade transiting the strait. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd suspended all Middle East shipping routes. On March 11th, the oil tanker Safe C. Vishnu, Marshall Islands flagged, U.S.-owned, was attacked by Iranian explosive boats near Basra, catching fire. One Indian crew member died. 15 Indian crew members were evacuated. And Dubai International Airport, the world's busiest, suspended flights after a drone attack sparked a fire nearby. Saudi Arabia diverted oil exports through the East-West pipeline to its Red Sea port of Yanbu. The UAE moved oil through the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline to Fujairah on the Arabian Sea. But the combined capacity of these bypass routes, 3.5 million to 5.5 million barrels per day, cannot replace the 20 million barrels that normally pass through the strait. Iran understood this arithmetic precisely. Iranian drones struck Oman's bypass ports of Duqm and Salalah, damaging fuel storage at Duqm and placing Sohar inside an insurer's war risk exclusion zone.
U.S. jets struck Iran's Karg Island oil hub, the country's primary crude export terminal. But President Trump publicly stated that he had chosen not to destroy the island's oil infrastructure entirely, warning he could reconsider if Iran continued disrupting shipping. The threat of mutual economic destruction hung over every decision on both sides. President Trump demanded that NATO nations contribute warships to a coalition to reopen the strait. The response from America's closest allies was, in almost every case, no. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Kallas, said after a meeting of all 27 EU foreign ministers that there was no appetite among European nations to join Trump's coalition. This is not Europe's war. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's spokesperson was more direct. As long as this war continues, there will be no involvement, not even in an option to keep the Strait of Hormuz open by military means. I would also like to remind you that the U.S. and Israel did not consult us before the war, and that Washington explicitly stated at the start of the war that European assistance was neither necessary nor desired. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the UK would not be drawn into the wider war, though he noted Britain was discussing use of its mine-hunting drones already deployed in the region. Italy's Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani said naval missions should not be expanded. Greece, Ireland, and Australia all ruled out sending ships. Japan said it had made no decisions whatsoever about dispatching vessels and noted that operations in the Strait of Hormuz might not pass legal muster under Japan's strict constitutional limits on overseas military deployments. On March 17th, President Trump called NATO's refusal a very foolish mistake and said, "We are going to remember." Iran's diplomatic position was equally unyielding. Foreign Minister Arakchi stated, "We have sent no message and have not requested a ceasefire. This war must end in such a way that enemies will no longer think of attacking Iran, and such attacks will not be repeated." He also maintained that the strait was open and only closed to enemies. Iran had elevated Khamenei's son Mojtaba, described consistently as a hardliner, to be the new supreme leader within days of the strikes. Tehran settled into what it appeared to believe could be a sustainable campaign of attrition, an asymmetric war of drones, missiles, and maritime harassment that it calculated the United States and its partners could not sustain indefinitely without fracturing the coalition further. Iran's strategic calculation rested on a specific assumption.
that stocks of air defense systems, particularly ballistic missile interceptors, were finite and would deplete faster than they could be replaced. Every wave of Iranian drones and missiles forced the Gulf states and U.S. forces to expend interceptors that took months or years to manufacture. Saudi Arabia intercepted a wave of 35 Iranian drones targeting its oil installations in the eastern province. The USS Gerald Ford carrier group was operating in the Red Sea and suffered a fire aboard that burned for more than 30 hours. By the second week of March, Iranian targeting had expanded beyond military assets to Western financial institutions, medical technology companies, and major technology firms. An Amazon Web Services data center in the UAE was struck in a cyber-physical attack that caused a complete power cut. China, which imports enormous quantities of Gulf oil and had the most direct economic interest of any major power in seeing the strait reopened, was placed under explicit American pressure to join the coalition. Trump suggested he might cancel his end-of-March summit with Chinese leadership if China did not contribute. Russia called for an immediate ceasefire and a return to the negotiating table. The International Crisis Group, assessing the situation on March 16th, concluded that with neither side positioned for a decisive win, the escalation risks are sobering, and called for an immediate mutual ceasefire as the overriding priority. Neither side was listening. The United States could not accept a closure of the strait without appearing to abandon the security guarantee it had maintained in the Gulf for 50 years. Iran could not reopen the strait without appearing to capitulate to the same military force that had just killed its supreme leader. Both sides were trapped, not by geography, but by the logic of the positions they now occupied. The world was watching a crisis that had been building for decades arrive at a point where neither party had a face-saving way out, and 20 million barrels of oil per day were not moving. The Strait of Hormuz has been strategically important for 2,500 years. The Achaemenid Persians understood it. Alexander the Great sought it. The Arab merchants grew rich through it. The Portuguese bled for it and declared that whoever held it held the throat of all trade. The British built an empire around it. The Americans deployed their navy to protect it for 50 years, and Iran, sitting on its northern shore, always knew that its geography gave it a weapon that no amount of sanctions or superior firepower could simply take away. What is different in 2026 is not the strategic logic. That has not changed since the first merchant ship navigated from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. What is different is the combination of failures that converged to produce a crisis that a decade of diplomacy was unable to prevent. A nuclear agreement that was built, then abandoned. A decade of maximum pressure without a diplomatic endgame. A midnight strike that killed a head of state on the day a peace deal had been announced, and the activation, at last, of the one response Iran had held in reserve through every previous confrontation. On February 27th, peace was within reach. Within 48 hours, it had been replaced by the largest energy disruption since the 1970s, a NATO alliance in open fracture, an oil price above $100, and a new supreme leader in Tehran with no incentive to de-escalate. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide. Through it, every day, under normal conditions, passes 1/5 of the world's oil. There is no alternative. There is no bypass that comes close to the required scale. There is no diplomatic coalition that has yet formed with the will or the capability to reopen it by force. And there is no clear path to the negotiated settlement that alone could reopen it peacefully. 21 million barrels, 33 kilometers, 2,500 years of history. The throat of the world is closed, and no one yet knows how to open it.